My heart stopped. The full chorus was singing again, louder as we got nearer. Sweet Adeline, old pal of mine. The Rod and Gun Club came into view, and so did we. Mary Alice was perched in the bow. Grandma was rowing steady, and I was in the stern wondering if the fish showed. It took the drunks on the porch a moment to focus on us. We were sailing right past them now, smooth as silk, big as life. You're the flower of my heart, sweet Ada. They saw us. And Grandma saw them, as if for the first time. She seemed to lose control of the oars, and her mouth fell open in shock. Mary Alice was already shocked and didn't have to pretend, and I didn't know where to look. Some of the business community were so far gone they just stared back unbelievingly. They thought they owned this stretch of the creek. A few, seeing that Grandma and Mary Alice were of the opposite sex, scrambled to hide themselves behind the others. But you never saw anybody looking as scandalized as Grandma was at these old birds in their union suits, and less. She was speechless as her gaze passed over them all, recognizing everyone. It was a silent scene until Sheriff O.B. Dickerson found his voice. Stop in the name of the law, he bellowed. That's my boat! Before the Rod and Gun Club was out of sight, Grandma had regained control of the oars. She rowed on as if none of this had ever happened. The sun was beating down, so she didn't push herself. After all, the sheriff couldn't chase us downstream. We were in his boat. Another bend and a flock of turtles sunning on stumps. Grandma pulled for the remains of an old dock. We tied up there, and now we were out of the boat, climbing a bluff. Grandma led, dragging the net of catfish. I was in the rear, doing my best with a picnic hamper. Mary Alice was between us, watching where she walked. She was scareder of snakes than she let on, if you ask me. An old house without a speck of paint on it stood tall on the bluff. Its outbuildings had caved in, and the privy stood at an angle. There were still prairie chickens around in those days, and they were pecking dirt. Otherwise, the place looked lifeless. Rags hung in the windows. The porch overlooking the creek had fallen off. Grandma tramped around to the far side of the house. She dropped her fish on the ground and waved us inside. Even in full daylight, the place looked haunted. I didn't want to go in, but Mary Alice was marching through the door already, so I had to. Is anybody inside? I whispered to Grandma as I lugged the hamper past her. Nobody but Aunt Puss Chapman, she said, like anybody would know that. It had been a fine house once. A wide black walnut staircase rose to a landing window with most of its stained glass still in. But it was creepy in there, dim and dusty. Smelled funny, too. We went into a room piled up with furniture. Then one of the chairs spoke. Where you been, girl? Mary Alice flinched, but the old woman lost in the chair was staring straight at Grandma and calling her girl. She was by many years the oldest person we had ever seen up till then. Bald as an egg, but she needed a shave. And not a tooth in her head. Who's them children with ya? She demanded of Grandma. Just kids I found along the creek bank, Grandma said to our surprise. They was fishing. I don't want them in my house. Aunt Puss Chapman sent us a mean look. Do they steal? Nothing you've got, Grandma said under her breath. Talk up, girl. Aunt Puss said. You mumble. I've spoken to you about that before. She pulled her shawl closer, though it was the hottest day of the year. I'm hungry. You hightailed it out of here after breakfast, and I ain't seen hide nor hoof mark of you since. She ain't seen me for a week, Grandma mumbled to us, but she forgets. Then she called out to Aunt Puss. Catfish and fried potatoes and onions, vinegar slaw and a pickled peach apiece, and more of the same for your supper. Well, I suppose it beats starving, Aunt Puss snapped. But hop to it, girl. Stir your stumps. I thought I might faint again. Nobody could talk to Grandma like that and live. She led us back to an old-time kitchen. It was in bad shape, but well stocked. Big sacks of potatoes and onions, cornmeal, things in cans, and we'd brought a full hamper to add to Aunt Puss's larder. I had to fire up the stove with a bunch of kindling, while Grandma and Mary Alice went to work on the potatoes and onions. Mary Alice was in as big a daze as I was. Grandma, is that nasty old lady your aunt? I stopped to listen. If she was, that made her our great aunt. No, I was hired girl to her before I was married, Grandma said. Lived in this house and fetched and carried for her and slept in the attic. You had a room in the attic? No, I just slept there. Had a bed tipped with straw in it and changed it every spring. I haven't always lived in the luxury you see me in now. What did she pay you, Grandma? Pay? She didn't pay me a plug nickel, but she fed me. I thought about that. And now you feed her, I said. But Grandma didn't reply. We cleaned the fish on the plank table outdoors. I didn't care for it much. It kind of made me sick to hear Grandma rip the skin off the catfish. But she had her own quick way of doing that. Every time it sounded like the fish screamed. She put me in charge of chopping off their heads, but I didn't like chopping off the head of anything looking back at me. And catfish have mustaches for some reason, which is just plain weird. Finally, Mary Alice took the rusty hatchet out of my hand and whoop! She'd bring down the blade and that fish head would go flying. Mary Alice was good at it, so I let her do it. Grandma gutted. It was afternoon before we sat down at the dining room table under a cobwebby gasolier. Aunt Puss was already at her place, so she was sprier than she looked. Grandma settled at the foot of the table. Without her hat, her white hair hung in damp tendrils. We'd been working like a whole pack of bird dogs. Watching Aunt Puss gum catfish was not a pretty sight. These fish taste muddy, she observed. You uns catch 'em? Yes, I said. No, said Mary Alice. What'd you use for bait? Aunt Puss said, looking at both of us. Cheese, I said. Worms, Mary Alice said more wisely. Since we couldn't get together on our story, Aunt Puss changed the subject. You children still in school? We nodded. Do they whoop you? Do they what? Mary Alice said. Do they paddle your behind when you need it? Aunt Puss looked interested. If they did, I'd quit school, Mary Alice said, who had just completed 3rd grade. They whooped that girl raw. Aunt Puss pointed her fork down the table at Grandma. I had a sudden thought. Aunt Puss thought Grandma and Mary Alice and I were all about the same age. She had not noticed the years passing. That's why Grandma didn't say we were her grandkids. It would have just mixed up Aunt Puss. That's when she came to work for me. They throwed her out of school. Aunt Puss peered down the table. Tell 'em why. We looked at Grandma, naturally interested to know why she'd been thrown out of school. Grandma waved us away. I forget, she said. I don't. Aunt Puss waved a fork. It was because you wadded up your underdrawers to stop up the flue on the stove and you smoked out the schoolhouse. That was the end of your education. Working for you was an education, Grandma muttered, though only Mary Alice and I heard it. It took us another hour to clean up the kitchen the way Grandma wanted to leave it. When it was time for us to go, Aunt Puss was back in her chair in the parlor. Where do you think you're off to now? She called out as we trooped through the front hall. Down to the sty to slop the hogs, Grandma called back. Well, don't dawdle. You dawdle. I've spoken to you about that before. Get on out of here, Aunt Puss hollered. Let the door hit you where the dog bit you. Outdoors, I said. Does she have hogs? She used to, Grandma said. She was right well off at one time. She's poor now, but she don't know it. How could she? She still had her hired girl and plenty to eat. You take her food every week, don't you, Grandma? Well, generally a good big roast chicken. She can gum that for days. Grandma turned down the lane. It keeps her out of the poor farm and gives me a quiet day in the country. That's a fair swap. Then her jaw clenched in its way. But it's just private business between her and me. And I don't tell my private business. We walked country roads all the way home. Grandma set a brisk pace, and I struggled along behind with a hamper heavy with cleaned catfish. Mary Alice went in the middle, watching where she walked. By the time we got home, the tree in Grandma's yard were throwing long shadows, and it was evening in her kitchen. Mary Alice and I were both staggering. I was ready to go straight to bed. But Grandma said, Skin on down to the cellar and bring up 15 or 20 bottles of my beer. Just carry 2 at a time. I don't want any broke. I whimpered. But she was turning on Mary Alice. And you and me is going to fry up a couple pecks of potatoes to go with the fish. There won't be nothing to it. I peeled the potatoes this morning before you two was up. We stared. The catfish fried in long pans with the potatoes and onions at the other end popping in the grease. The kitchen was blue with smoke, and night was at the windows before we finished up. Now, get down every platter I own, she told me. Then she sent me for the card table I had used for my jigsaw puzzle of Charles A. Lindbergh. Following her lead, we carried everything out into the night, making many trips. We lugged it all across the road and up to the Wabash Railroad right-of-way and planted the card table in the gravel. Finally, the platters of fish and potatoes overlapped on the table, and opened beer bottles stood in a row beside the tracks. As the drifters came along, being hounded out of town, Grandma gave them a good feed and a beer to wet their whistles. Mary Alice helped in an apron of Grandma's that drug on the ground. They were hollow-eyed men who couldn't believe their luck. 2 or 3 of them, then 5 or 6, then a bunch standing around the table eating with both hands, sharing out the beer. They didn't say much. They didn't thank her, but she wasn't looking for thanks. She'd taken off her overalls and put the same wash dress back on, but she'd tied a fresh apron over it. Her hair was a mess, fanning out from the bun at the back, white in the moonlight. She watched them feed, work in her mouth. Then we saw the swinging lanterns, the sheriff and his deputies coming up along behind to keep the drifters moving. Up trooped O.B. Dickerson, dressed now, with his badge on and his belt full of bullets riding low under his belly. His deputies loomed behind him, but they weren't singing Sweet Adeline. Okay, break it up, he said, elbowing through the drifters. Then he came to Grandma. Dag nabbit, Mrs. Dowdle. You're everywhere I turn. You're all over me like white on rice. Now, what do you think you're doing? I'm giving these boys the first eats they've had today. Or yesterday, a drifter said. Mrs. Dowdle, let me explain something to you, Sheriff bawled. We don't want these loafers. We want them out of town. They are out of town. Grandma pointed her spatula at the sheriff's feet. The town stops there. We're in the country. Yes, and I'm sheriff of the county, O.B. Dickerson bellowed. You're in my jurisdiction. Do tell, Grandma said. Well, run me in. The minute she said that, all the drifters looked up. That was when Sheriff Dickerson's deputies saw they were outnumbered. Mrs. Dowdle, the sheriff boomed. I wouldn't know what to charge you with first. You're a one-woman crime wave. Where'd you get them fish, for instance? He said, wisely overlooking the home brews in the drifters' hands. Out of a trap in Salt Creek, Grandma remarked, same as you get yours. O.B. Dickerson's eyes bulged. You accusing me, the sheriff of Piatt County, of running fish traps? He poked his own chest with a pudgy finger. Not this morning, Grandma replied. You was too drunk. The drifters chuckled. And talking about this morning, the sheriff said, his face shading purple even in the darkness, you stole my boat. That's what we call larceny, Mrs. Dowdle. You could go up for that. Oh, well, the boat, Grandma said, making a little gesture with the spatula. You'll find it tied up at Aunt Puss Chapman's dock. As a rule, I take it back where it was. But, of course, I couldn't do that this morning. How could I row these grandkids of mine back past the Rod and Gun Club? They'd already seen what no child should. The sheriff and his deputies, blind drunk and naked as jaybirds, dancing jigs on the porch. And I don't know what all. It's like to have marked this girl for life. Grandma nudged Mary Alice, who stood there in the big apron looking drooped and damaged. I'm thinking about taking her to the doctor so she can talk it out. I don't want her to develop one of those complexes you hear about. Whoa, the deputies murmured behind Sheriff Dickerson. Earl T. Askew stepped up and said in his ear, O.B., let's just let sleeping dogs lie. I got my hands full with Mrs. Askew as it is. The sheriff simmered but said, Okay, Earl, if you say so. The sheriff and his posse were in retreat now, but he had to cover himself. Mrs. Dowdle, he said, pulling a long face, there's things I can overlook, but it seems to me you're running a soup kitchen without a license from the Board of Health. I have an idea there's a law against that on the books. Well, go look it up, O.B., Grandma said. See if there's a law against feeding the hungry. But I have to tell you, you've talked so long, the evidence is all add up. And of course it was. The drifters had wolfed down every last morsel. With one small finger, Mary Alice pointed at the bare platters. Only a faint scent of fried catfish lingered on the night air. The empty beer bottles went without saying. The drifters were moving off down the track, and the deputies were heading back into town. O.B. Dickerson spit in the gravel, swung around, and followed them, his big boots grinding in gravel. We stacked the platters and rounded up the beer bottles for Grandma's next batch. I collapsed the legs on the card table. There wasn't a lot of music in Grandma, but she was humming as we worked, and I thought I recognized the tune. The night that Patty Murphy died, I never shall forget. Then, after our quiet day in the country, we carried everything back across the road under a $silver moon. End of chapter 3.